Well now, if it isn't a pair of familiar faces.
Hello, today's character analysis is a bit special because we'll be looking at the very first character we encounter when we fire up the game, Hydaelyn. Yeah, that was 9 years ago for those of you who started in 2.0. And after many years of waiting, we finally got her full story in Endwalker. Because turns out, this giant speaking blue crystal is an actual character. Who would have guessed? The sole question we ponder today then is, was her story good? Was the wait worthwhile? Oh, and spoilers and all that. Now, because this video is rather long and encompasses a variety of topics, all of which are under the umbrella of Venat's character, I wanted to add a little rundown of the video's content here to hopefully make the video flow a bit better. So this video is essentially split into 3 parts, each about half an hour long, and a bonus segment. Part 1 has me going over Venat's story, providing my thoughts about its execution along the way. I talk about her personality, mention relationships with other characters, discuss some of the design choices, and so on. The usual if you watch my content. Part 2 is mostly critique about the execution of certain things surrounding Venat's character. The first half is critique I commonly seen pop up in the community, the second half is some of my personal gripes. Part 3 will be praising the Hydaelyn fight and then reflecting on her death scene. We'll then round it off with a bonus segment where I talk about some of the neat details behind Venat's character. Right, that's the gist of it. As always, there are chapters so that you can easily jump around the video. A lot of hard work went into this one, so I hope you'll enjoy. Now, when we talk about early FF14, Hydaelyn got basically the same treatment as the Ascians in this story, obscure as heck until Shadowbringers. In fact, one could say that while the Ascians were generic bad guys doing bad things in the background, Hydaelyn was a generic good guy doing good things in the background. She speaks something ominous, grants you the blessing of light which basically gives you superpowers, directly intervenes in the fight against Atma Weapon and Lahabrea himself, and well, that's about it. The first turning point of sorts happens in 3.4, when Hydaelyn fails to stop the flood of light from engulfing most of the first, and Ardbert does a little baby rage. This was the first time the devs put this thought at the back of the player's head of, oh, maybe there's something else going on here. But we still don't know anything about Hydaelyn's origins, what are her motives, why exactly does she oppose Zodiac, that kind of stuff. Shadowbringers, being the expansion that basically answered everything, then of course answered those questions.
Formed of faith and prayer, of conviction and devotion. The eldest and most powerful of primals.
Fast forward to the end of the expansion, you then finally meet Hydaelyn face to face in 5.5 when she appears to warn you about the coming darkness that will bring about the end, obviously referring to the 6-hour-long queues that will accompany the Endwalker launch. After either unsubbing or grinding Borgia for a few months, you enter Endwalker and there she is, among the first few characters you meet in the story. You talk to her on the boat and what's this? There's only 2 dialogue options, both of them basically, what the hell Hydaelyn? But of course none of this came as a surprise, as it was all set up and intentional.
It was by design?
So in Shadowbringers we got the Ascian/Zodiac side of the story. We learn of the tragic fate that befell the Ancients, why Zodiac was created, the conflict between Zodiacs and Hydaelyn's factions, and of course, the horrible event that was the Sundering of the world. They do something interesting here, which is that they show only the Ascian side of the conflict, as it is all narrated by Emet-Selch. Thus they deliberately leave out Hydaelyn's side of the story, and we are left to doubt her. This is naturally accompanied by Shadowbringers being all like, darkness isn't inherently evil, nor is light inherently good, a message which works both ways, further adding to the whole questioning of if we're doing the right thing just because we fight for Hydaelyn and the light. But mainly this doubt comes in the form of questioning Hydaelyn's role in all of this. You know, why she opposed Zodiac, and more importantly, why did she sunder the world? And mind you, this idea of doubting her isn't just my interpretation, it's very clearly something the writers intended, As I alluded to with the first Endwalker encounter with Hydaelyn having both dialogue options be confrontational, there is no "I believed in you all along, Hydaelyn" option, which to me is a pretty clear sign that, yeah, that's precisely what the devs wanted players to think. And on that front, I think they did a very good job. With dialogue like this,
Though I imagine your mother would offer a rather contradictory account, as is her wont.
After hearing what transpired in the first, I began to question the true nature of Hydaelyn's blessing. A topic I have discussed at some length with Y'shtola.
I made inquiries of my own, and as far as I am able to tell, Hydaelyn has not made her will known to anyone.
I see no reason why she would deny you her guidance altogether.
both of these dialogue bits plant this idea in your head that Hydaelyn is hiding something from you. I must say, as far as setups go, I think this was very well executed. There was certainly a lot of discussion surrounding Hydaelyn during Shadowbringers, and especially just prior to Endwalker. Okay, but enough talk about the setup. What about the execution? As in, how can we reflect back on that now that we've finished the story? Let us first consider the biggest decision the writers made that would shape Venat as a character. We have this conflict, the Sundering, which Shadowbringers spends a great deal exploring the ramifications of. They then basically had two choices with Venat: either make her not responsible for the Sundering, or do make her responsible for the Sundering. To not make her responsible could have been something like having it be an accident, or something along those lines. Now, obviously the writers chose to go with the second option, but I nonetheless find it interesting, as I think either way you could have had interesting dilemmas and drama with Venat's character. More than likely they went for the latter option as a way of subverting the player's expectations, as I assume most people were expecting the Sundering to be some kind of a mistake, because surely no one would wish to intentionally bring this amount of suffering, right? Then the writers could be all like, "Psych, it was 100% deliberate," and the audience goes, And I'd say this was largely successful, given the overall fondness of Venat in the community. Of course, some people may disagree with the choice of having her be fully conscious of the choice to sunder the world, while still keeping her essentially as a good guy and justifying it. But I think we can all agree that it's a good thing they avoided the generic trope of having her turn out to be some mastermind villain all along. You know, the overplayed, "Oh no, your god was evil all this time." It's nonetheless interesting to me to see a character created this way. They were essentially working backwards by having the Sundering be explored first, then creating a character revolved around justifying it. I'd say this was a very ballsy move, as it's rather difficult to justify such an awful event as it was portrayed in Shadowbringers, but this difficulty does also explain why, to some, it was a hard sell. More on that in a bit.
Venat is her name, and she is the previous Azem.
What makes the Elpis segment so impressive to me is that they managed to accomplish quite a lot within that relatively short time we got to spend with those characters. Now, you may disagree with the time travel premise, but at least they used that time wisely. Specifically, one of the most awesome things in this segment is how smoothly it manages to make us like Venat, someone whom we knew zero about prior to entering this place. A big reason for that, I think, really comes down to the really solid introduction to her character in Elpis. We pretty much immediately get what her character is all about. She shows a lot of warmth, compassion, is innately curious, and seemingly has a lot of wisdom to boot. What's not to love, right? Plain and simply, a lot of the success behind Venat comes down to the buttery smooth dialogue, great voice direction, and of course the talent of the voice actors involved. I've only played in English, so I can only speak for the English VA, Joanna Roth, but I've no doubt they are all of similar quality. With Venat, we have basically three distinct voices. First, we have the warm, motherly type of voice, which plays into the whole thing of her being a source of guidance through the story. Then there's the more stern and assertive voice, which is reflective of the more typical ancient's way of speech, which comes out when she's not messing around and whenever she's being decisive. And the final one, which is also my favorite, the Azem voice.
How very exciting. I'm quite fond of delving into the unknown. And there's naught more unknown than the future. Dark hidden places, rife with danger. Those have an altogether different, but no less powerful sort of appeal. Else I wouldn't have marked you so clearly, and sent you unto myself in the past. It's precisely the sort of mischief I would get up to, and quite inspired, if I do say so myself.
The reason I love this voice so much is that it really brings out her curiosity and adventurous spirit, which in turn makes us really attached to her. Which of course makes sense, as she used to be Azem. And I just want to point out that the decision to make her into Azem was brilliant. Precisely because of what I just described, we immediately gain a semblance of attachment to her in the very first scene. Speaking of Azem, how was the relationship between them? Because it can't be a video about an ancient without discussing Azem. Venat clearly seems to hold Azem in high esteem. After the one-on-one fight, she recalls how much tenacity and strength they had, despite being way younger than her. She also passes on Azem's words with a clear tone of fondness as she's empowering the Warrior of Light's Crystal of Azem, words that she still remembered after millennia. Wow, that's pretty powerful, right?
But pray, remember this. When the way forward is hidden, even from the mind's eye, look not to the invocation, but within yourself. These were the words of the crystal's original bearer.
There's also the fact that she tried to contact Azem before the Sundering, though I will elaborate more on that point later. While we are on the topic of Elpis, let me bring up another memorable piece from there, the solo instance. The one-on-one against Venat was excellent. It's just so fun to see a character actually swap jobs mid-fight and how her attacks are teamed after those jobs. I especially appreciate Dancer getting some appreciation, but mainly, I very much appreciate that they went through the effort to record an entire freaking song just for this one instance. They wanted to make this a memorable fight, which would further help you bond with Venat, and by God they nailed it. I remember when I did this for the first time, one of my first thoughts was, why did she add one job of each role, thinking if it had any significance, and then this awesomeness is followed up by letting you do a dungeon with the 3 ancients. Bro, it's actually happening. I knew it! Yeah, boy! Oh, that is so high. I can't fucking believe it. Oh boy. This may be just a huge coincidence, but I happened to have a fitting interaction with all 3 of these characters on my first time playing through this dungeon. Besides the one I shared between Emet and Hydaelyn in my Emet video, the one I had with Venat was when I tapped Super Bowl Light to soak some damage, and she more or less immediately used Benediction on me. I was like, wow, that's so fitting to her character. She even has a line associated with this very situation.
I will tend your wounds.
How cool is that? All in all, getting to bond with Venat in Elpis was a blast and certainly one of the most memorable parts of Endwalker for me, and I'm sure for a lot of you guys as well. Let's now move on to talking about the Sundering. So, Venat takes notes during Meteon's reports, which I think is a rather organic way of showing her wisdom. Specifically, she paid attention to this planet's fate.
One race had discarded all things that gave rise to sorrow, hoping to have only joy. They found joy lost its savor in the absence of sorrow, and lost their will to live.
We later find out that this was referring to the third world we encounter in Dead Ends, The one where that Ranga thing goes around clapping people who have become full of apathy. At this point, she might assume that their own star is on a crash course towards becoming just like that, but in general, she's shocked at the fact that all these stars met the same fate by trying to get rid of sorrow and suffering.
Can it be true? Are we the only ones left who see beauty in the world? In life? Are the stars above no more than husks of fallen civilizations?
Which in turn jumpstarts her adopting a new kind of an ideology, the one that we see later on, that you can never fully permanently get rid of that stuff, that to live is to suffer, and that you ought to use that to basically gain strength through adversity.
Long ago, the inhabitants of myriad stars, many more prosperous than Atheris, sought to free their worlds from life's woes. Sorrow and anger, conflict and hostility, despair, and even death itself. But as Meteon reported, every attempt ended in failure. Darkness abideth within every living being and can never be cast out. Neither reason nor faith can challenge this immutable truth. To live is to suffer. And in suffering, find strength and purpose and hope.
Which leads us into the scene. You know, the one where she do the tang and the world splits. Let's talk about that one, because I've got some things to share.
So let there be no way back. From that temptation, I sunder us. No more shall man have wings to bear him to paradise. Henceforth, he shall walk.
Holy hell, is there a ton of emotion packed into this scene. The cinematography was on point, the dialogue was god tier, the way they used and recontextualized answers was genius, the way she takes the hits as she's walking, suggesting the pain people go through with the rejoinings and how that weighs in on her, the imagery contrast between her walk and you approaching Emet, suggesting a similarity not just in your and her suffering, but also the similarity between her and Emet-Selch. The heart-wrenching expression Hydaelyn makes as he turns around, and then Emmet's own reaction to it making such a gut-punching exchange of like 5 seconds with no dialogue. I mean, I could keep gushing on and on about this scene, but I'll bring up what is probably my favorite part.
It is weakness. No paradise is without its shadows. If we cannot accept this truth and learn from our pain, then our plight shall be repeated.
O mighty Zodiac! God, born of our boundless faith, we bid you, hear our prayer. Accept this offering of lives, and deliver unto us the lives we once had. Deliver unto us the days of old, the days when the star was a font of love, and we knew naught but bliss.
The expression she makes after the ancients more or less ignore her statement about moving on and proceed to sacrifice themselves to Zodiac is so fucking powerful. In that instant, you can tell so many emotions flooding through her mind. Anger, anguish, grief. It is in this moment that she realizes what she has to do. You might say I'm reading too much into this, I don't care, but I'd imagine that Venat underwent the same mental gymnastics as Emet-Selch in regards to the whole naive hope that there would be a path of lesser tragedy, as it were. In fact, I reckon the similarity is so hilarious that the specific person they hoped could resolve it was the very same, Azem. Remember that Venat did try contacting Azem, but they didn't respond. Whether or not you find her actions justified, it's still worth mentioning the fact that she didn't just instantly jump to, oh, genocide is the solution. She did try to find an alternative, but there were none she could see. I am sure that every single person watching this video has been in those situations where you fully processed a situation, you know exactly what you have to do, but you're having a hard time coming up with the strength and the courage to actually go through with it. That's Venat in this moment. This is her coming to an acceptance that this is the only way, or at least the only way she herself can see in her mind. This is her processing the full extent of the consequences of her actions, and it terrifies her, as it should any sane mind. She is about to permanently offer both her and all her followers' souls to become this god, heal everyone, end the entire civilization as they knew it, subject people to a miserable existence where they will die for no reason repeatedly, while also getting slaughtered en masse by the Ascians, who themselves will also go crazy due to the sheer depression resulting from her actions, while she herself will be in complete solitude for thousands of years, watching those people she created suffer endlessly. All kinds of thoughts like this, and probably way more, would all be on her mind at this moment. I think even being in that position of having to make such a nightmarishly difficult choice is enough to snap most people mentally, but she is able to tap into her love of people, nature, and the beauty of life itself, and thus gain the resolve to carry on with this decision. Because in her mind, if she does not go through with this, then all life, beautiful or otherwise, will end. I mean, damn, that's the kind of bravery and resolve that only an Azem could have. And that is why I think this scene is incredible. And this leads us into a brief yet interesting topic to discuss, looking at the story from Venat's POV, as in, how did she fare through all of this experience? Much like Emet-Selch, Venat's personality changes quite a bit as a result of the Sundering and the toll that sort of a traumatic event takes on a person. It's a bit difficult to describe in words, but when you hear her speak in the present, whether that's on the boat, in Labyrinthos, or before the trial, you can tell a slight difference in her inflection from the one in Elpis. She speaks with a lot more weight, if that makes sense. It's also no coincidence that her default expression in her Hydaelyn form is this very tired facial expression. This is the result of spending over 10 millennia in solitude. She probably had it even worse off than Emet-Selch, as she was completely alone and she had the knowledge of how the Sundering went down, which in this case is more of a curse than a luxury. She herself did that, and she had to cope with the choice she made. Though she was resolved in the moment, I like to imagine that it probably took her a very long time until she finally came to terms with her decision. How often has it happened to you where you went through with something and you were all fired up to do it in the moment, but then the ramifications of what you just did don't hit you until later, or sometimes way later? I'm sure that as millennia passed, the weight of her decision must have become more and more difficult to bear. Every time the Ascians caused a lot of damage and she sensed millions of people dying both as a shard was obliterated and a cataclysmic event played out in the source, it all must have been gnawing on her more and more. It's made even worse by the fact that she was essentially powerless to stop those calamities, more so as time went on. By the time of the 7th Umbral calamity, all she could really do was AFK and watch them pop. Pretty horrifying if you think about it. Now, initially she may have tried to cope by blaming the Ascians, but ultimately she would have realized that she is also responsible for all of this. I believe this is what she is referring to after the trial, when she says there was no kindness nor justice in the tragedy she caused. I think some people really gloss over the significance of this line. She's not just saying that because she feels bad in the moment. That is the state of mind she has been for the past thousands of years. Regardless of whether or not you agree with her choice to sunder the world, the point I'm making here is that there were no winners in this situation. And I think that's a key part of the ancient story. It's very tragic and it sucked for every single person involved. The more character analysis I do on the ancients, the more this point becomes apparent as you watch these videos. Since I mentioned Emet's hypocrisy regarding certain things in my Emet-Selch video, it would be remiss of me to not do the same, as there is some of that going on with Venat as well. The main thing that stands out to me is her whole mantra about wanting humanity to forge their own path, yet by withholding information regarding the threat behind the final days and making a decision on her own to sunder the world on behalf of an entire race, she clearly did not afford that same treatment towards the ancients. I find these kinds of contradictions with characters like Emet or Venat interesting because it shows just how flawed these individuals are, and we can pretty safely infer, thanks to the Omega quests, that this flaw with Venat's logic was very much deliberate, as in it was precisely meant to be kind of grey. Another thing I observe while thinking about the Omega quest is that Emet-Selch and Venat are really two sides of the same coin. Emet-Selch wanted to sacrifice all current life, the sundered people, for the past. This is because he believed that was the right thing to do given the knowledge he had. Venat wanted to sacrifice all current life, the ancients, for the future. This is because she believed that was the right thing to do given the knowledge she had. There are differences in semantics, of course, but I believe this was the main thing the writers wanted to portray, the duality between these two characters. They both threw a very similar judgment, which we can judge either in favor of the other or judge them both.
So here I am, Venat. I suppose you needed me to tie it all together.
So her relationship with Emet-Selch is rather interesting. Pre-sundering, she clearly respects his station, as is custom for the ancients, but this doesn't come off as just a formality to me, rather it seems she genuinely admires his wisdom and mastery over Ether.
Have faith. If Emet-Selch is the man Azam described to me, we've not seen the last of him.
Post-sundering, however, there's an interesting dynamic because even though they never directly interact, we can see that despite them being on opposing ends of a conflict, they don't seem to despise each other at the end. When she speaks to you for the first time through Cryo, she mentions that she pulled Minfilia from the livestream of the first, as well as another,
and another who may yet have a part to play, though that will depend on you.
Which was some good foreshadowing as we later realized she was referring to Emet-Selch. It's of course possible she did this for a purely pragmatic reason, expecting Emet-Selch to be of use to the warrior flight at some point later down the line, but I don't think so. I think she did actually see past Emet's actions and decided to give him this opportunity to now make a decision when he has his memories fully restored, because she knew he'd ultimately do the right thing due to his love for the star, and I could definitely see her doing this as a way of an apology for never telling him. On the other hand, Emet-Selch speaks somewhat fondly of her after being summoned by the warrior flight in Ultima Thule, reframing his millennia of suffering as her playing a prank on him as an Azam.
So here I am, Venat. I suppose you needed me to tie it all together, these frayed threads of our history. But knowing you, I suspect there's a joke in it too. Oh yes, I can imagine you gloating over my forgetfulness. Were I feeling charitable, I might assume you had left room for the possibility of this outcome. Even so, you'll get no applause from me. A single gesture will not lighten the burden I've had to bear.
I always found this a bit odd, but I suppose the message here is, well, first of all, the ancients are crazy as hell, but besides that, I think the reason Emet-Selch can let go of his hatred towards her is because of this line.
Still, you must be commended. Our methods would not have brought mankind this far.
In other words, he commends her due to her solution being correct in the end. He may, and does, fundamentally disagree with this path, but he sees the merit and recognizes her love for the star being equal to his. On the other hand, Venat most likely didn't hold a grudge on Emet despite being the architect behind the calamities, because she's able to recognize that she was the one to put him in that position, both due to the sundering as well as allowing him to escape the effects of it. I also want to point out that neither of them really have a moral high ground which to judge the other on. She judged the Ancients' right to exist due to what she perceived was the best path by looking to the future. On the flip side, he judged the sundered people's right to exist due to what he perceived was the best path by looking to the past. Both of them judged and deemed an entire race to be unfit to exist, to which they both responded with genocide. One of them judging the other on moral standards would be the pot calling the kettle black. Moreover, I think in the end, the two were able to sympathize with each other's plights despite their ideological differences. They both carried huge burdens and spent a long time in solitude. In the end, their stories were rather similar, weren't they? In that sense, I really like the dichotomy between these two. I kinda wish they had gotten to interact at least once post-sundering, but on the other hand, I think the way they did it creates some intrigue about how the two truly felt about each other, as we never see this exchange actually take place. You may recall in my Emet-Selch video, I pointed out how mentally strong Emet-Selch was to have been able to go through the sundering experience while carrying all that burden. It's the same case for Venat. These two were individuals who willingly took up an insane burden and carried it for thousands of years in complete solitude. I mean, this is on a level that is just unimaginable for us to comprehend. Like a healthy human being alone for a few days or weeks, that kind of an experience will completely shatter their mental psyche. The amount of mental fortitude required to survive this experience without your mind completely collapsing is just insane and unfathomable. How then was Venat able to do it in even worse conditions than Emet-Selch? Well, I believe there are two rationales, one very pragmatic and boring, one a bit less so. The more pragmatic reasoning would simply be that she's a primal, which could have changed her physiology to the point that she was able to withstand the mental deterioration that would result from such an extremely traumatic event, followed by more such traumatic events, and the prolonged state of absolute solitude, guilt, and regret. The more interesting reason, and the one likely intended by the writers, is that she did have one advantage that Emet-Selch and the other two unsundered didn't. Certainty. The Ascian plan reeked of desperation, and they were indeed acting out in desperation when they went for the rejoinings. With Venat, however, she knew for a fact that if she toughed it out for thousands of years, that she would eventually encounter the warrior flight. She was then able to desperately cling to that hope, which gave her the energy to persevere. And you know, when you think about it that way, it really emphasizes our importance and more specifically, the type of a special bond that exists only between the warrior flight and Venat. The warrior flight Venat dynamic is interesting in general. These are two people from two different eras connected by a rather thin thread, yet there is a level of intimacy there as they share a kinship that not a single other soul is aware of. Venat's view of the warrior flight is also interesting in a sense that she acts as a kind of a guiding mentor, but also looks up to them in a certain way as I had just described. I think this is a huge reason Venat is such a beloved character. The relationship between her and the player is possibly the most unique out of the entire game. Whereas Emet-Selch was a villain whom some people considered not to be a bad guy, Venat was a hero whom some people considered to not be good. And in both cases, it's a cause of the same thing. Emet is designed to be a villain, but his story was so sympathetic, some people didn't see him as one. The inverse of that is Venat, someone who was designed to be a hero, but whose story was such that not everyone could sympathize with her choices fully. In other words, there's a whole lot of grey in both characters. There's also an important distinction here as to what we consider success between each case. With Emet-Selch, this can be seen more as a compliment than anything, because if a villain is sympathetic enough that people consider them not to even be villainous, then you've done a good job, I think. Venat is a more technical case, however. She's meant to be a hero, so when she appears villainous in her actions to some people, well, that could be seen more as a failure than the reverse, if that makes sense. Personally, I think there are both aspects of success and failure here, which I'll go more in detail later. Note my wording when I say some. I chose this particular wording because I definitely do not think these are the majority of people. However, I also don't believe it's some obscure minority either. These takes can appear anywhere when it comes to FF14 discussion. Hell, it even appeared in the comments of my Emet-Selch video, and when this discussion fires up, there tends to be a real support for those takes. If it was some garbage hot take made up by a select few, then it wouldn't garner that sort of a support, as people would just ignore them. In my Emet-Selch video, I made the counter argument to some people's claims of him not being a villain by stating how I view a villain in a story. I basically pointed out a rather simplistic perspective, which is to simply look at the narrative itself, rather than the morality and justifiableness of their actions. Emet is antagonistic both by standing in opposition to the core themes of the story, but also by literally opposing the protagonists from whose perspective the story is told. We can then look at Venat from the same lens. None of her actions over the course of the game stand in opposition to the party. On the contrary, she's always aiding the protagonist, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly. She's also in the right, in quotations thematically, since the way the story is told, the ancients wanted to remain in the past, while she wanted to look to the future, which is a sentiment supported by the story. In that sense, you would be hard-pressed to really make a case for how the narrative structurally depicts Venat as some kind of an evil character or a villain. Yep, so that's it. She's a hero, the minion even says it, end of discussion. Well, not quite, as I think the interesting part of the discussion is to get into why people feel that way towards Venat. It's also worth noting that it feels like these sentiments were way fewer when the expansion came out, and have become more prominent as of recent. This makes a lot of sense, because after the emotional high of Endwalker, people have been able to reflect more on the story. Heated discourse surrounding Venat is usually sparked by people not agreeing with the choice she made and them feeling that the game forced them to appreciate said choice. The choice I am referring to is, of course, the choice to sunder the world. Now, I want to begin by saying that I think conceptually/thematically it was an excellent idea. In Shadowbringers, the conflict between Zodiac and Hydaelyn is presented as one group is stuck in the past and refuses to move on, while the other group didn't want to be stuck in the past and instead wanted to look to the future. This is kind of the crux of Emet-Selch's character in Shadowbringers 2, so it makes sense the Ancients as a whole are represented that way. So in Endwalker, when we got the opportunity to explore this conflict more, it seemed pretty solid, as we would get Venat's perspective and how she came to choose that the only course of action was to shatter the world. In addition to the whole past versus future thing, there was also this question of perfection leading to apathy and apathy leading to death, versus accepting that suffering always exists and is a prerequisite to both happiness and life. So when I put it like that, a character who fought for the future and to preserve life should be viewed as a pretty heroic figure within the story, right? And so it is for most people, yet this sentiment isn't shared by everyone.
This warrants further investigation.
So I looked into it and spent some time reading these Venat critiques, and I've managed to boil it down to 3 reasons why people may have disliked Venat's portrayal in the story. Mind you, it could also be a combination of any or all 3 of these things. So here they are. 1. People disagree with Venat being justified in sundering the world. 2. People disagree with the reasons behind her sundering the world. 3. People disagree with Venat being viewed in a positive light by the game and their character. So we are going to start off with the first point. Was she justified? Obviously, this is very heavily based on opinion, so there isn't a definitive answer, but we can at least discuss it a bit and try to figure out what the writers were aiming for here. Conveniently, there is a story that explores this very subject that we can examine, the optional Omega quest in 6.15, which has been described as somewhat of an epilogue to the 6.0 story. At the end of the storyline, Omega visits the Watcher in Mare Lamentorum to better understand the final days and how the Ancients dealt with it. The Warrior of Light then explains the full story of Emet-Selch, Hermes and Venat as they saw it unfold. Omega then directly attacks the warrior flight's front view of Venat and likewise gives perspective to the other two ancients. You then get to express which of the three ancients, if any, or all were justified in doing what they did. I myself went with the option of none of them being justified. The reason I didn't feel that Venat was justified is this. She considered herself to have the right to shatter the known world, exterminating an entire race in the process and basically giving up before even trying to change their fate. And honestly, you could say this was the case for all three of them. All of them wanted to play God, all of them willing to sacrifice everything to achieve their goals, all of them made a decision on behalf of an entire race. When I was discussing this topic with my friend, he had a really funny and solid conclusion about the ancients. Maybe sacrificing everything simply isn't the way? So the common thread here really is that the ancients are simply built different. It seems to be that when an ancient is distressed, they are very prone to black and white thinking. They are also extremely entitled and arrogant to a fault. Now combine this with the fact that they are very powerful beings and, well, notice how a small group was able to summon Hydaelyn and cause the extermination of their entire race? This kind of power is quite simply insane. It's like if one guy in our world had the power to nuke the entire world. And this sentiment is echoed by the writers themselves, where they wanted to precisely convey this idea of how the ancients were completely different from us normal people. It makes sense for us to judge them so, because it's hard for us to justify someone making such drastic decisions for all of mankind. Hence why I went with the non-art justified option. But do you think she was justified, or any of them? Let me know what you picked and your reasoning. I'd be happy to hear it.
Please.
Moving on to the second reason some didn't vibe with Venat's story. For some, it simply comes down to the execution behind Venat's decision to sunder the world, despite it sounding wonderful on a thematic level. Those pesky details that ruin every writer's story, am I right? And I can think of at least three things. 1. Time travel. This is already problematic because I know quite a few people who immediately get turned off by time travel being used to explain anything within any story. So as a trope, it's already not desirable, I would say, especially when it's combined with another hated trope that I'll mention in just a bit. Not to mention that FF14 is an instance of using multiple time travel theories within the same story, which further causes confusion. Anyway, because Endwalker is a causal loop, it already creates a conflict with Venat's motives. Those who watched my Emet-Selch video may recall the discussion I had surrounding his supposed tempering by Zodiac and how I'm not really a fan of leaning too heavily into that, given it removes agency from his character. It's more or less the same thing here. If we suppose that Venat went along with the plan for no other reason than, oh, the warrior of light told me that's how it went down, so I simply follow the loop, then that's not particularly interesting, as it makes for a boring excuse for her decision and removes all free will from her actions. Now, I don't think the devs intended you to think that way, nor do I think that most people do. Heck, even I myself don't lean too heavily into this mindset, but it's still worth noting as a factor that could put some people off, and it exists purely as a result of them deciding to use time travel to resolve this conflict. 2. Amnesia. This is the other hated trope I referred to just now, which was used in conjunction with time travel to set up this conflict. Once again, ignoring that there will be people that are immediately put off by amnesia within any plot to resolve something huge, especially when comboed with time travel, it additionally creates issues with Venat's character, namely, their decision to make Venat the only person who was aware of the cause of the final days and creating this rather silly arbitrary restriction where Venat cannot go to the convocation because Hermes might go cray-cray, which some people saw as a clumsy excuse. Keep this part in mind because I'll follow up on it later. 3.
Dynamis, we call it.
Dynamis?
Dynamis. Dynamis.
Dynamis.
Because Dynamis was added so late into the overall FF14 story, it naturally raises a lot of questions, as it's deliberately set up as a very mysterious type of force we don't know much about. The devs have said that Dynamis wasn't a concept when Shadowbringers released, when the outline of Endwalker would have been written, which makes sense because it's not alluded to at all in any of the Shadowbringers patch content. This particular comment by Yoshida has led me to a theory. Because I have a peanut brain, the only way I could make sense of this whole dynamic situation was to put on my tinfoil hat and create some wacky crackpot theory about the game's development. My theory basically goes that the reason Dynamis wasn't originally part of the script was because of Venat. That originally, Venat sundered the world simply due to ideological differences, the ones we see in the game. But then they realized, oh yeah, she looks kinda evil right now, so they cooked up Dynamis for a more concrete justification for the sundering, in addition to the ideological differences between the Ancients and Venat. Mind you, this is just a silly theory with no evidence, don't put too much weight on it. But theory or no, the whole Dynamis justification felt off for some people, because it simply raises a lot of questions. So those three elements I think contribute to why some people felt off about Venat's character. I think the degree to which this stuff bothers you really depends on A, how much you dislike these tropes, B, how used you are to seeing them, and C, how much do you care about the details of the plot versus the overall thematic significance and emotions behind the characters. Personally, it didn't bother me as much as I make it sound through this analysis, because I saw the overall point and I didn't get too hung up on the details, but I reckon I might end up being a bit more critical once I New Game Plus and do my analysis of Endwalker. Who knows? Now, neither of the previous points in and of themselves would be enough to make people dislike Venat, I think, but it's this next point that basically turns those matters into actual issues, which is the feeling that the story portrayed Venat as a hero of sorts, when some didn't feel that way about her, creating a disconnect between the player's own thoughts and how their character reacted. One thing I noticed when I went back to look at the dialogue choices, when you meet Hydaelyn in the present, after ITS scope, there is no option reacting to her negatively, only positively. On the flip side, during your first encounter with her, when she appears as an avatar on the ship at the very start of the game, the only dialogue options are negative. This to me seems like a strange design choice. It's like you are forced, you as the warrior of light, to look at it only the one way. What if someone believed in Hydaelyn despite Shadowbringers and thought only positively of her? What if the same person then changed their mind after Elpis and viewed her negatively? What a jarring experience that would make. This probably goes a long way in explaining why people felt that way, that the game tried so hard to portray her in a positive light, so to speak, because you aren't really given an option to combat that. Most likely the devs thought that after Elpis and seeing her perspective, combined with Yshtola's explanation that the sundering was necessary so we can use Dynamis, plus the thematic significance I spoke of earlier, vast majority of players were in agreement with Venat's choice, so there was no need to have an apprehensive dialogue option anymore. It could have simply been miscalculation on their part, to put it plain and simple. Keep in mind that if FF14 was a JRPG with a main character whose story we follow, say we were playing as Cloud Strife, then this wouldn't be an issue because we would merely be spectating the main character. But since in 14 we are meant to represent the protagonist, obviously one of the worst things that can happen is your character saying something you don't feel like you would say. That's pretty much an immediate disconnect. Something interesting they could have done is take a note out of classic FF titles. I don't know if they have the capability to do this, so maybe it's a bit ambitious, but do you recall how in some older FF titles, you would have these hidden counters? Like in FF7, the dialogue options you give to characters determining who you'll get the date with in Gold Saucer, that kind of stuff. They could have done something like that with Venat, where if you give negative/positive options, the counter would increase in one way or the other. And if you had a negative view on her, the trial would be framed slightly differently. Instead of a test of your fate/determination, it would be more like an actual confrontation of Hydaelyn. The cutscene following the trial would also slightly change, but the outcome is the exact same. So it's the same thing, just changes in semantics. And yes, that would also include the dialogue of the Scions to also be more confrontational. If the counter was positive, well then it would just be the same thing as in the game proper. An alternative and a simpler fix that wouldn't require any new system is to go with the tried and true method of giving a positive, neutral and a negative response. I gushed in my Xenos fight video about how effective this was, so it strikes me as strange that they didn't utilize the same opportunity here. The negative option would express you being unable to condone her actions, something to that effect. The neutral response would have you approaching the fight with a mentality of, I don't want to fight you, but I also don't agree with what you've done. Show me how to reach Meteon. In which case, she'll still go through with the whole, no, not until you prove yourself to me. I also want to add that, in an interview, Natsuko Ishikawa had said that when she wrote Hermes, she expected 80% of people to hate him and 20% to like him. I'm wondering if Venat was written with the same expectation, just the other way around. If this is true, I'd say it's fairly accurate, as the Venat like to dislike ratio does seem to be about 80 to 20. But also, if we suppose this is true, then why not account for those 20% of people, as it's kind of strange thinking back to how there were only 2 dialogue options before and after the fight. Surely it wouldn't have been too much hassle to slam in a third option. The most logical thing I can think of is that they simply did not want to write dialogue for Hydaelyn that were responses to these confrontational/negative dialogue choices. In other words, it's an artistic choice. I don't think it's a lack of foresight because they did put a lot of effort into this fight in general, so... However, if you were someone who was annoyed at this lack of ability to express your character's view on the matter, the aforementioned Omega quests do provide a fix of sorts, where the devs finally gave the players the opportunity to have their warrior flight express their view on Venat, as well as on Hermes and Emet-Selch. It's funny actually because this storyline feels like a genuine fix to basically all the critique I have just been talking about. Yes, it's optional, but I also understand why it's optional, not only because it requires the completion of the Omega raid, because of course Miss Ishikawa wanted to continue that storyline, but also because it does fit a lot better as kind of a cherry on top. If I had to really critique it for one thing, I wish it was available right at launch instead of having to wait half a year for it. But oh well. I really appreciated this Omega questline because it allowed me to reflect on these characters and made me realize that even though I can't justify their decisions from a morals point of view, I nonetheless like them as characters in the story because I nevertheless found value and interest in examining their flawed decision making as guided by their questionable moral compasses. In other words, we don't necessarily have to agree with a character to still find them entertaining. Let's now move on to talking about the Sundering. Ooh boy, this is gonna be another funky subject, isn't it? I want to dedicate an entire segment to the level 87 scene, Thou Must Live, Die and Know, otherwise known as the Sundering scene, because I've thought about this scene quite a lot for the past year that Endwalker has been out, and I really want to share some of those thoughts, even if I can already tell that some people will recoil at the thought of criticizing this scene. Though, don't worry, I will be praising it at the end as well, you know, kind of like a compliment sandwich of sorts, if you will. Now, the most recognizable aspect of this scene is how this sequence is purely symbolic or metaphorical, however you want to phrase that. You are basically witnessing a memory of the events that played out, thus it's a rather condensed and not necessarily very coherent as far as, you know, representing how these events actually went down. And that's the first thing I disagree with. I fundamentally do not agree with the design choice to make the cutscene like that. I would rather have had them play out the events as they actually happened. Seeing the convocation reacting to the final days, them discussing possibilities and coming to the decision of summoning Zodiac, which was most likely suggested by Fandaniel as he was the one knowledgeable of the celestial currents, here, us as the viewer could feel the irony in him being the one to come to a solution to a problem he himself created. We might see Elpis being eager to prove himself by offering to be the heart of Zodiac, basically giving some representation of that one Shadowbringer side story, but in the actual game. You could additionally have a quick scene mentioning Azem leaving the convocation due to disagreeing with the Zodiac plan, as we know happened. We would still keep the heart-wrenching scene of Hydaelyn offering to sacrifice himself to Zodiac, only I think it would be even more powerful here, as we could actually have a brief exchange of dialogue between him and Emet-Selch. Then we see Zodiac summoned in his full form, and we see the final days averted, but at a cost. Now the land has been poisoned, winds die, the seas rage, the earth decays. So the convocation proposes another sacrifice, requiring yet again half of the population. However, this time there is opposition to this idea. We see Venat and her faction form. They try to argue with people, and this scene goes largely the same as the cutscene in the game. Venat and her faction argues with them as they don't want to sacrifice and wish to instead move on, but people reject their thoughts and want to offer more to Zodiac regardless. And so another sacrifice is made. Venat is absolutely appalled at this, just like in the game. This is where we see Venat's resolve, and it would basically be as powerful as in the game. Then, when the third sacrificing is announced, where they would sacrifice the lesser life forms to bring back those they've lost, Venat's response is basically no more, as she realizes talking won't help anymore. They must take drastic action if the sacrifices are to be stopped. This is where she accepts that to sunder the world is the only way. She and her faction march to the capital, Amarod, and confront the Convocation. The debate gets really heated on both sides. Elpis leaves Zodiac to act out his role as the emissary and help solve this heated conflict between the two factions. Venat realizes there can be no resolution with words and pulls out her sword. We see a man standing in front of the Convocation, Lahabrea. He says, "You would destroy it, our beautiful world? Venat, you are making a grave mistake." And she basically says her lines from the cutscene as a response.
I choose to believe in mankind's potential, in his ability to find a way forward. So let there be no way back. From that temptation, I sunder us.
But she stops at that last line. She doesn't say the line yet. Venat's faction then perform the summoning on the spot as they offer their lives to fuel this primal. The Convocation looks in horror as the primal takes shape. Then we see Venat transform into Hydaelyn as Answers fully fires up. Once Zodiac realizes her intention to sunder the world, he sees her as a threat, and it would seem conflict is all but inevitable. We see Zodiac towering above Hydaelyn. He is absolutely enormous. This is the most powerful god the world has ever seen. At his full might, Hydaelyn is nonetheless resolved and engages Zodiac. I would imagine this fight would play out similar to Thanos vs Hulk in Infinity War. Zodiac is extremely powerful, but because he doesn't have Elpis piloting him, he isn't as skilled, which gives Hydaelyn an edge, as she is the complete contrast, a very skilled warrior. Similar to her trial fight, she takes full advantage of all three of her combat styles as she struggles against Zodiac's onslaught. But make no mistake, she is still extremely lethal, as is he. Once again, bear in mind, this is the two at their full power. The two fight ferociously, heavens fall and the ground beneath them trembles. It's akin to the end of the world. It's clear this isn't just some cute little skirmish. For all intents and purposes, it's a battle the likes of which you have never seen before. I mean, for God's sakes, it's the two eldest and most powerful of primals duking it out. Consider some final bosses from this franchise. You got beings that break the laws of the universe, destroy entire solar system, create big bangs, all sorts of crazy shit like that just to do some damage to the heroes. Yeah, this battle would be something like that. Ridiculous, yet epic to an insane degree. Yet, we all know how this ends. It's apparent that Hydaelyn could never fully defeat Zodiac. She does spot an opening, however, and charges up for her ultimate attack, the power to sunder worlds. She concentrates her mind on this attack that would shatter her adversary into 14 pieces and the world alongside it. In that split second, all the ramifications of what she is about to do enter her mind, but she nevertheless proceeds with a fiery resolve. As this is happening, she delivers the line, "No more shall man have wings to bear him to paradise, henceforth he shall walk." The second part being delivered in perfect sync with the Hydaelyn kick that delivers the final blow on Zodiac. The world is split, and I would play the last part, Venat's walk, the exact same as we saw in the game, cause that scene is immaculate as it is. Oh, I would also feature a very brief, like 10-second explanation on how Emet-Selch and La Habrea survived the Sundering, instead of answering it in a bloody Q&A. Well, there you have it. I guess this was basically my retelling of how I'd pictured the final days going down. But I have made this part with an actual point, which is that I hope by demonstrating it, you'll understand the value I see in the events being played out as they actually happened, versus the symbolic version we got in the game. The idea behind this cutscene was obviously to have it be focused solely on Venat, but I personally disagree with that choice. Yes, you can have the emphasis be on Venat, have this very much be from her POV, but it shouldn't have come at the expense of everything else. What expense am I referring to? Well, besides this alternate version offering a lot more characterization from all the ancients involved, which is why I included those parts with Vandanion, Hytlo, Emet, Elidibus and La Habrea in them, as well as giving a more coherent explanation on the true sequence of events, oh, and actually explaining WTF happened to allow the boys to go on unsundered, I have two main gripes with this cutscene as it is in the game. Those two gripes are as follows. Number 1. The way the scene portrays Venat as doing all of this alone. I actually think this is a disservice to Venat's character. Her followers chose to make the ultimate sacrifice for something they believed in, while also believing in her. And keep in mind, we find out that they didn't just die, they mega super omega died. What I mean is that unlike those who sacrificed themselves to Zodiac, like Hythrodeus, they didn't get to keep their soul and be reborn. And as I spoke in my Ustora video, in a world where rebirth isn't just a theory or a religious thing, but rather something absolute, taking that away from someone is probably the most terrifying thing. These people were willing to go that far for their cause. Plus, they didn't even know the full extent of Venat's plans. They were about as much in the dark as everyone else. All of this is to say, the people in this faction got quite a raw deal, to put it mildly, but chose to go with it nonetheless because they genuinely believed in her. Yet in this scene that plays out in the game, those people don't exist, it's all about Venat, me. I don't think this was intentional at all, mind you, but in my eyes, it devalues Venat's character slightly because it makes her seem like kind of a cunt, as if the sacrifices made by those people didn't matter and that it was all about her. Number 2. The fact that we never got to see a fight between Zodiac and Hydaelyn. The decision to leave this out altogether absolutely puzzles me. Listen to the way Emet-Selch describes this encounter in Shadowbringers.
And so they fought, and they fought, and they fought, and in the end, Hydaelyn was victorious. With all her strength, she smote him, dealing a blow so devastating that it split the very fabric of reality. And thus was Zodiac banished and his being divided.
Does this not sound like a battle of truly epic proportions? And if Heavensward taught us anything, is that our perception is different from those who don't age, such as the dragons, or the ancients in this case. When he emphasizes 3 times how they fought, I get the idea this wasn't some brawl that was over in 5 minutes, but rather a prolonged encounter that may have spanned days, weeks, years, maybe even decades. But that is a speculation, of course. However, I just cannot comprehend how they had the perfect opportunity to display this encounter thanks to the way the story unfolded in Endwalker, and never took it. This could have easily been the coolest cinematic in the entire game. And something I wanted to emphasize in my imagined version of the fight, you could have still kept all the same powerful emotional impact that the actual scene in the game had, if not even more powerful potentially. Another reason it baffles me is due to the apparent dedication to show summon battles in FF16. I gushed about this in my summons video. Basically, I'm really glad they are doing it because for me, these epic encounters between summons or other major entities are a huge component I love in Final Fantasy titles. So how is it possible that they didn't go for it when they had the opportunity to make among the best ones yet? Now, I know what some people might interject with. It's just eye candy, who cares, what matters is good writing and that the scene is emotional. Don't get me wrong, I do think it's important to have good writing as the foundation. Just look at a lot of the modern movies. They have huge budgets and a lot of talented artists who can create immaculate CGI work, but the writing sucks ass, so it's akin to trying to polish a turd. It just doesn't work. However, when you have a solid foundation, then having eye candy is basically a cherry on top. When you saw the Bahamut cinematic for Realm Reborn, or the Shinryu vs Omega fight in 3.5, or any number of cool moments while fighting primals, you can't tell me those didn't add to your enjoyment, despite them being basically just eye candy. They served the plot and delivered amazing visuals on top. It's a win-win. Or, to use another example, the Seed of Sacrifice encounter. Elpis is doing so much cool shit in that fight, yet it also hits hard emotionally, doesn't it? That's basically what I think could have happened with the Zodiac/Hydaelyn fight. Not style over substance, but rather style accompanied with substance. I say them not including this fight puzzles me, but I do have an idea that rationalizes the decision in my head, though this is once again pure speculation about the development behind Endwalker. See, one might easily assume that the choice to make this cutscene symbolic instead of a real retelling is a purely artistic one, and that could very well be. I myself choose to believe, however, it was a deliberate choice made due to a lack of time and resources. In an interview, lead scenario writer Natsuko Ishikawa had mentioned that there were originally meant to be two distinct expansions, one that heavily featured Garle mode and would have ended with Anima, and one featuring the Zodiac/Hydaelyn story. In other words, a decision similar to Stormblood was made to condense two topics into one expansion. There are certain ways that this decision is quite apparent, as I no doubt go more in detail in my Endwalker analysis, but for the purpose of today's topic, I think one part that may have taken a hit was precisely this whole Sundering scene. A real retelling of the events would have required a lot of work, not to mention a whole encounter between Zodiac and Hydaelyn. I mean, that's a lot of budget right there. It stands to reason that they had to axe things to roll out such an ambitious expansion within 2 years, whose development was partly affected by a pandemic as well, and I could easily see this being one of the things being on the chopping block. I admit I have no real evidence for this. It's really just a gut feeling based on analyzing that Sundering scene. When you actually look at the scene, you can see how efficient it is with its assets, such as everything happening in the Emerald dungeon or the reused animations. Mind you, I'm not trying to downplay the efforts of the development team. I am sure they still poured a lot of love into this scene, but there's just this feeling I have it was made with some constraints. I want to end this segment by emphasizing that despite these complaints, I still absolutely love this scene, and if my theory holds any water, then that makes it all the more impressive that it managed to convey such strong emotion. It's still one of the top scenes without a doubt, so please don't mistake this criticism as me pretending it's a trashy scene or anything like that. Rather, the reason for this segment is simply me feeling that this scene had a ton of lost potential in my eyes, and I think it's a damn shame. And it may sound like I'm extra harsh, but it's mainly because this is such an important scene. I mean, it's literally the single most important event in setting, so it's natural for someone to hold it to a higher standard than, I don't know, a scene where Graha is enjoying a burger. You can enter this trial with trust? You can enter this trial with trusts? Oh my. Alright, now let's get to talking about the real shit, the Hydaelyn fight. Honestly, feels like this video was just an excuse for me to gush about this encounter. You know, after the Seed of Sacrifice in Shadowbringers, I was really eager to see how they could top that fight, since for me, that was something I had never seen before from an MSQ boss fight. And out of the 3 fights we got in Endwalker, I personally found that the Hydaelyn fight managed to top it. That's why I wanted to dedicate an entire segment to talking about the fight. First of all, I just want to say that conceptually, I love the fact that we fight both Zodiac and Hydaelyn in this expansion. For a story that took so many twists and turns, it's kind of funny to me that the one thing that was easily predictable did happen. In the Famitsu Endwalker interview, the devs confirmed this and said, yeah, that was very much intentional. They wanted to make parts like this to be more predictable, but to balance out the plethora of unexpected developments that happened along the way. As some of you may have gathered from some of my videos, I'm not a huge fan of how many writers today go for the whole idea of, oh, we gotta subvert their expectations no matter what, so they pull some garbage twists that make no sense. As such, I really appreciate situations like this, where the writers can take a step back and realize, oh yeah, sometimes it's good to go for the more logical and predictable. I also think that the way you encounter Hydaelyn makes for a nice contrast to Zodiac. When you fight Zodiac, you are shocked. We are fighting this guy now? Let's perform the invocation of Elder and get this shit done with. But with Hydaelyn, it's more like you see it coming, you accept it. Now, another thing I want to comment on is simply her appearance. Originally, it was intended that Hydaelyn's face closely resembles Venat, but the devs were like, I mean, Zodiac doesn't look too much like Elpis either, and they instead wanted to make her appear closer to Yoshitaka Amano's concept art. According to Mr. Yoshida, it took about 1 month of adjustments to finalize Hydaelyn's model based on Mr. Amano's art. That is some serious dedication, and it definitely shows in the final product. They nailed her in-game model perfectly from their Realm Reborn cover art. I just love how the Warrior of Light, Hydaelyn and the Endsinger are all such amazing depictions of the Amano art style put into the game. You can really tell the developers worked their ass off to replicate the work of an artist they deeply admire. I love it. Now, let's talk about the fact that you can do this fight with trusts, which is probably the biggest thing that impressed me with this fight. I mean, damn, just recalling the first time I did this, and then I hear all the characters making their speeches, I was like, this is pretty typical JRPG stuff. Characters reflecting on how fast they come, how resolved they are, blah blah blah, just before the final boss. But then I stopped to think, but hold on, isn't this usually the part in which they're supposed to give us an excuse as to why they cannot participate? Then when the game said you can enter with trust, I was mind blown. At one point, Mr. Yoshida was asked if they will do more trials as 8-man fights that can be done with trusts. His response was basically that doing this fight was very brutal, which is why the other trials weren't usable with trusts. Apparently a full-on boss fight is way harder to program the AI to work on than a simple dungeon, which is why they aren't doing it, as it would require lots and lots of effort. Yet they chose to do it anyway for this one trial. Now, let's be real here, they didn't have to do this. They could have just made this like any other trial and call it a day, but the devs chose to go the extra mile just because they felt that this fight was special. This is the kind of magic in game development that I just adore. When you have passionate people working on a project who choose to go really above and beyond to deliver something that they truly put their heart and soul into. I can imagine the conversation when something like, can we implement trust into this fight? I don't know, we never done it before and it would take a ton of trial and error. Then someone steps in and goes, yeah, but we're having the characters fight Hydaelyn to test their resolve. This one deserves to have a complete experience with the Scions. Then everyone goes hell yeah, followed by them probably sleeping in the office the next couple of weeks. But no, when I think of a fight that needed trusts, I can't think of a better choice than the Hydaelyn fight. It could have been so easy for them to only focus on the journey of the Warrior of Light. How back in Realm Reborn you needed Mommy's protection to stand a chance against the Atma weapon and La Habrea, to then defeating powerful opponents like Thordan, Shinryu, Emet-Selch and Zodiac, 3 of them basically on their own. But it's important to acknowledge the journey of the rest of the main cast. Alphino, Alize, Ustola, Tancred, Urianger, Estinian, Grahatia. You've spent such a long time bonding with these characters, watched them grow and overcome their own trials, their own sorrow and despair. That is why Hydaelyn speaks about each and every one of them and their triumphs. It's to emphasize that point that just as you have the faith to overcome despair itself, so do they. As they've been through so much shit and you've watched them come out on top. And just as you've taken on more powerful opponents, so have they. Remember that these guys were struggling to fight basic Garleans at first, and they always had to back out of any meaningful conflict while you go deal with it. They went from that to holding their own against powerful Sin Eaters, Light Wardens, Emet's recreation of the final days, souped up, transformed Telephroi troops, a slew of lunar primals including lunar Bahamut, to defeating Anima and fending off all its trolls, to then fighting the actual terminus beasts of the final days. and now they're squaring off with Hydaelyn herself. You could pretty much say that all of Shadowbringers and Endwalker leading up to this point has been that anime training arc for the Scions. So this point is essentially the culmination of all the struggles they have went through, both their personal conflicts as well as them becoming stronger in pure combat capability. And that is exactly why, if there had to be only one fight that could be done with trust out of the entire FF14 story, this had to be it. Some could intervene and ask, what about the final boss? Since it's the final obstacle to overcome, wouldn't that have been more fitting? The way I personally see it is that the real payoff for all they have been through IMO happens in the Hydaelyn trial, and that Ultima Thule and the Endsinger fight were more just a cherry on top for the party, like a formality if that makes sense, and that rather the final part felt more like a personal conflict for you, the Warrior of Light. After all, you'll personally deal with both Meteion and Xenos at the end. So no, it's not out of place for the penultimate boss to deserve special treatment compared to the final one. As for the implementation of the trusts in this fight, it's just phenomenal, what else can I say? Let's start off with how the fight demonstrates the personality of each character. They deliberately change some of the AI around to reflect how these characters think and behave, and they put in so many moments to allow these characters to shine in their own way. Estinian starts out the fight very aggressive and greets a lot, though calms down and plays it safer as the fight progresses. Y'shtola is the only character to not get hit by something you can dodge because of her ether sight and how she went into the fight most careful. Tancred will actually let you tank Hydaelyn and will focus instead on mitigation. Urianger looks like an absolute Chad when he's using collective unconscious during the ultimate. Alize gets her opportunity to fire an LB3 in the fight and has a badass voice line to go with it. During the ads phase, Alphino is the only character who actually gives a response to Hydaelyn's call, while the rest of them focus on the situation. And Grahatia will call out the player by their name at the end, encouraging them to go on. And then we have the dialogue. Oh my gosh, there's so much dialogue, it's insane. And the dialogue isn't just the characters reacting to what's going on, but they also help each other deal with the mechanics and are encouraging each other. The true camaraderie that exists between them really shows through their comments. I mean all of this, is what we love about video games, right? When developers take full advantage of the ability to interactively tell a story. This kind of stuff, where it isn't just a cutscene but rather very organic characterization, is simply awesome. There's no other way to describe it. Love it. Alright, let's talk about the fight itself, cause I want to mention a few points. First off, her opening line is sick.
I, the last of my kind, shall test thee. Come, prove thy worth.
I, the last of my kind, shall test thee. I'm so glad they put in this line. On one hand, it's an acknowledgement by the developers that the story of the Ancients is about to draw to a close. On the other, it's such a fitting line from Hydaelyn. And for the player, the Warrior of Light, it places great emphasis on the fact that yes, she really is the last Ancient. If you go through with this and kill her, that will be the end of their race. It's almost like the final opportunity to back down. But of course you are resolved to go through with it, even if it comes at such a great cost. Although it is funny to consider that the Warrior of Light essentially finished off two entire civilizations, the Ancients and the Omicrons, by defeating Hydaelyn and Omega respectively. In addition to trusts, there's another unique mechanic to this fight, and it pairs with the trust system quite nicely. If you die, you can get revived X amount of times, which goes up every time you wipe. See, as I had just explained, one thing they wanted to achieve with this encounter is to show how capable your party members are, that they aren't just getting carried by the overpowered Warrior of Light in all things. But doing the fight this way presents a challenge. If the trust can do all the mechanics, what about players who do it first time and might get hit a lot? Then they die, and it does indeed make the Scions look really capable in contrast, to the point that they appear better than the Warrior of Light, which obviously doesn't make narrative sense. It's like, then why am I even here? So their solution to this was to introduce this mechanic I had just described, where the players can get knocked out and still come back, through what is essentially sheer power of will. It's so cool and a very interesting solution to the aforementioned problem, not to mention metal as hell for the Warrior of Light to basically say nope to to getting mortally wounded over and over. But what about when she says the thing though? You know what I'm talking about, it involves 3 verbs. Alright, let's talk about easily the most memorable aspect of this fight.
The song of creation's end. Feel. The sorrow at hope's demise. Think. And find your way in the darkness.
A year later and I still think this was pure genius. Getting the full context of hear, feel, think, delivered in such a way in the fight. Ay, the feels, man, the feels. I also want to mention the significance of this ultimate. She does the Hydaelyn kick and proclaims you must flee if you cannot withstand it. This is basically her test of your resolve. This attack is basically the same sundering move she used on Zodiac all those ages ago. And even though it's obviously significantly weaker, it's really quite impressive that you managed to withstand it. And not just you, but everyone else as well. It's at this point she realizes you are the real deal, and the rest of the fight is more just a test of your endurance, stamina and strength. Finally, the visuals. They really pulled all the stops when it came to this fight. The animation work is so smooth. And the arena background is stellar. It actually changes quite significantly and a few times depending on what she's doing. Now, dynamic backgrounds have been in the game for a while now, but never to this extent. It's such good eye candy. Oh, and as a side note, I love a quote she has in EX. If you reach her end rage, she'll say,
"Flee! You have been found wanting."
Which I found kind of a terrifying thought. Like, imagine if this was a game with multiple endings and this was one bad ending where you can't prove yourself and have to flee. Yeah. All in all, the reason this one is my fave, I wanna say it really comes down to the insane attention to detail and innovation. You can definitely tell that the developers truly wanted to make this fight as memorable as possible because it shows in every aspect you could look at. More fights like this, please.
At last, man has the strength to...
This then conveniently segues us into Venat's death scene, aka the point where they play Flow and start printing tears from the players. This may be a bit of a weird way to start this, but I find it worth noting that Venat chose to die. This is an important distinction because in the case of, say, Emet-Selch, he fell to us in combat because both sides were 100% ready to kill the other. However, that was not the case with Venat. She could have stopped the fight at any point and said, "Okay, yeah, you have proven yourselves." In fact, it's likely she got her answer after the party survived her ultimate. In that sense, she could have done the same thing she did in the one-on-one fight against the Warrior of Light, where after the ultimate she could have been like, "Okay, yeah, that's good enough." Or heck, she could have just stopped halfway, 75% through or whatever. However, she chose to go hard till the very end and burn all of her soul in the process. There are a few ways we can interpret as to why, all of which I'm inferring from what she says after the fight. 1. She felt like it wasn't a true trial unless she tried her absolute hardest and went all the way. She does mention after the fight that it was a true test of your strength.
I have always kept a reserve for this very moment. It was a true test of your prowess. You have done well.
2. She probably did genuinely want for you to outdo her, as she says afterwards that you have surpassed her expectations and her as well.
And so it came to pass. Now you, my chosen, have surpassed my expectations.
Surpassed me. I entrust the fate of the universe unto you.
3. She most likely enjoyed the fight. I mean, listen to her after the fight.
Though my power is in constant flux, I have always kept a reserve for this very moment.
Even some of the lines she has during the fight suggest she's really getting into this, and no wonder. Remember that she's Azem, and she's AFK'd for thousands of years waiting for this brawl. Man, I keep telling you, these ancients are fucking nuts. No other way to get dopamine, so she has to wait over 10,000 years to have a fight to the death with her biggest fan to feel something? Man. Now, that was discussing it from an in-setting, in-character point of view, but from a writing point of view, her death was more or less guaranteed. On one hand, I would like to applaud them for actually killing a character off for once, but this is such an obvious one to do, almost a low-hanging fruit, so I'm not sure how much I'm willing to praise them here. Nevertheless, her death was still really well executed. For one, I didn't expect them to go that ham into it by giving her an actual permadeath. As I've stated earlier, in FF14 setting, the worst consequence you could give to a character isn't actually death. Rather, there's still a tier below that, which is when someone dies with no chance of rebirth. Venat's death here was such a case. They even straight up said in a Q&A, just to make sure there is no misunderstanding or wiggle room, she is dead, soul and all. Damn.
I'm just going to give a straight answer here, and that is Hydaelyn was completely destroyed.
But I do agree with their choice. Ultimately, Venat was such a great character, it does make sense to give her such a harsh punishment. Though all the ancients had a tragic story, she may have had the worst ending from a purely logical perspective. Actually, there is one character that could contest it, who I would say had a more raw deal to boot, but that'll be the topic of another day. What I like about her death as well is how it's thematic to how she originally didn't want to return to the star because she felt she could still help people. But now she felt like she had truly fulfilled her purpose, so she dies happily. In a sense, she honored that particular tradition of the ancients and made that whole thing come full circle. It's just satisfying seeing a character work towards such a huge life goal and after a long struggle, finally achieving it and then seeing the elation as a result.
With that, my work is finished.
In general though, her death scene does hit pretty hard regardless if you saw it coming or not. They basically waited the whole expansion to play Flow for this moment and it works so well. Apparently Naoki Yoshida had to cry over and over as he was checking the scene. Poor guy, I was already a wreck after having to rewatch it once for this analysis. Last point I want to mention are the two dialogue options at the end. Though I expressed earlier that there could have been more variety in general with Hydaelyn's dialogue options, I actually thought this last choice was perfect. For those of you who watch my Xenos video, you know I love gushing about dialogue choices, so let's do this. There's basically two things going on here. The way you bid her farewell, as well as how you choose to address her, both change in those two choices. I'll start with the way you address her. You can either call her Hydaelyn or Venat. I think it's quite natural to go for calling her Venat, as it's much more personal, as only you know her by that name, while for everyone else, she's Hydaelyn. And I'm pretty sure that this was by far the most picked dialogue choice, but I think calling her Hydaelyn has its merits too. Referring to her as Hydaelyn could be considered a more respectful approach, if that makes sense. Hydaelyn represents those ideals she wanted you to carry on now, so by specifically calling her Hydaelyn, you appeal to those ideals. And because Hydaelyn is what she's become and has been for the last few eons, you are commending her for her job as the will of the star. In a sense, it's like the difference between calling someone by their name versus their title. Call them by their name and it's a lot more personal, or call them by their title and you show respect to their position and their achievements. And if you recall how referring to people by their titles is an ancient custom, since Hydaelyn could be considered her new title, if you choose to call her that, you are honoring that ancient tradition, or if you choose to call her Venat, then you are eschewing that custom, which also is fitting since obviously Venat was very different in many respects from the ancient norm at the time. The other difference is, well, what you actually say. In the first option, you show your gratitude. In the second option, you give her reassurance, and it's also a nice callback to one of your exchanges in Elpis.
And amidst it all a people, beacons of light and life, laughter that warmed my heart like naught else before. They are my meaning, and my purpose, my love. And so long as they need help, I cannot return to the star. Perhaps my future self is still waiting for it. A moment she can let go and walk unto the end. Safe in the knowledge that man will find his own way.
Which additionally reaffirms to her that you remembered. I think here as well, it's really a matter of taste. Do you want to thank her for all her sacrifices, or show your conviction? You could also argue that one way or the other, both sentiments are implied either way. There's a minor difference in her own reaction as well. She has this cry of happiness in both scenarios, though when you call her Venat, she clearly is a lot more emotional, which makes sense as that option is a lot more personal, as I had just described.
With that, my work is finished. Fulfill our promise. Right the wrongs committed when the world was yet whole. Silence the song of oblivion. Teach her a brighter melody. Show her our journey is far from over.
Of this, I have no doubt. For yours is a light brilliant beyond measure. Long after I have gone, though not even my soul remaineth, my love will be with you forever, my dearest children.
And so, that marks the end of Venat's story. But with her approval to go after Meteion and her spirit to guide you along, you feel like you can take on anything and press on. She may have been the last ancient to live, meaning their story is now truly over, but through you they live ever long. So may you ever walk in the light, and remember that they once lived. Since you all seem to like the Symbolism segment in the Emet video, I figured I'd do it again here, as there's a fair bit to share regarding Venat. You could consider this chapter as kind of a cherry on top of the video. I'm just going to share some tidbits that may not be relevant in the grand scheme of things, but I figured would be worthwhile sharing. So here we go. Alpha and Omega. I would first like to point out the significance of Hydaelyn being in the cover of both A Realm Reborn and Endwalker's collector editions. She's also the only character present in both the intro as well as the credit sequence of the whole saga. This signifies her role as kind of an Alpha and Omega, aka an omnipresent god throughout the whole game. Why the name Venat? Venat's name has caused a bit of confusion among people who have tried to make sense of it. Unlike most of the ancients, such as Hades, Hermes, Hephaestus and so on, Venat's name doesn't follow the convention of naming them after ancient Greek gods. Some people have speculated that she could be named after Venus instead, but this isn't true either. The name Venat comes as a reference to Final Fantasy XII, where you have an ancient that turned their back on their kind. Eyes and appearance. So in my Emet video I mentioned that each of the major ancients' eye colors symbolize something. For Venat the answer is rather boring. Yeah, she has blue eyes after the crystal, since she's basically Crystal Mom. Yeah, not a huge revelation, I know. Though beyond that, one could obviously extrapolate a lot, as there are millions of interpretations for colors. One interesting link I think is blue being most commonly tied to the sky or the water, and Venat's theme song, Flawed, is fittingly water themed. I think that bit may have been intentional. Also, blue is often used to depict wisdom, which is rather fitting for Venat. Weapons. Venat has 3 weapons which she uses in the solo instance fight as a trust member and of course in the Hydaelyn fight. I personally think the significance behind these weapons isn't so much the weapon itself, but rather to which class it's tied to and what it typically represents. My own interpretation is thus: the sword, Paladin, represents fortitude, the staff, White Mage, represents faith, and the chakrams, Dancer, represents inspiration. All combined, this basically symbolizes how she had the fortitude to remain in solitude, the faith that humanity would surpass her through the warrior of light, and inspired humanity and the warrior of light through hope. Argos. Many of you no doubt noted the similarity between Argos and Minfilia, which is a neat detail, but there's also a few more things to mention regarding Argos. First, the dog breed itself. Argos is an Afghan hound, which is one of the most ancient dog breeds, which is fitting for someone who is, an ancient. And to make up for Venat lacking an ancient Greek mythology tie-in, we do get it in Argos, who was of course Odysseus' faithful dog. Hear, feel, think. The decision to explore Hydaelyn's calling, hear, feel, think, came from Natsuko Ishikawa herself. She was fascinated by the inclusion of think in there, so when she wrote the MSQ, she wanted players to not only see and hear, but also think about what they've experienced up until now. In setting, this line is also interesting as it turns out that Hydaelyn actually got the line from Meteion. This reaffirms what I said earlier about Venat truly paying attention to Meteion's report. Her using those three verbs against Meteion is her basically trying to use her own logic to defeat her, and it worked. There's also many instances of hear, feel, think throughout the game. We hear it as we fire up the game, it's in the song Answers, it's heard again in Shadowbringers when Elpis is awakening people through the star shower. We then hear the Meteion version in Endwalker, and then later Hydaelyn's full interpretation during the Hydaelyn fight. The latest one was snuck into the side story that featured Venat as Hearken, Feel and Understand. There's also an interesting contrast between Venat's Hear, Feel, Think and Emet-Selch's Look, Learn and Remember, which really emphasizes the difference between the two characters, so I'm pretty sure this was intentional. It's also cool that if you combine the two messages, these two ways of thinking, you get something that is arguably a bit more whole. Hear and look, feel and remember, think and learn. Songs. Next, let's nerd about some of the songs associated with Venat. Answers has always been my favorite song in the game bar none, and Endwalker did nothing but bolster that position by recontextualizing it and giving it a second meaning. Additionally, the song is titled Your Answer because just before the fight, Hydaelyn is asking your answer for the question she posed to you in Elpis. Has your journey been good? Has it been worthwhile? What I love about this is that you never answer her, not in Elpis nor in here, but you indirectly give your answer in the fight itself. You fought with a tremendous amount of conviction, faith and courage. As such, your journey must have been worthwhile for you to strive so. Then we have Flow and Flow Together. I love the contrast between these two. Flow Together features warm instruments, signifying Venat's warm, motherly nature. Flow, however, features the piano, one of the coldest instruments, and fittingly plays when Hydaelyn is dying. This is basically her passing her spirit on to you, so the song has more of a sad tone. Flow does play a second time, in your encounter with Meteion after defeating the Endsinger, which at first might be a bit odd, since this is supposed to be Hydaelyn's song, but it actually makes sense because this song plays when Hydaelyn asks you to teach Meteion a brighter melody. In a sense, this song represents that brighter melody, so when you meet Meteion again, you are sending Venat's spirit onto Meteion through this song, just as she asked. In the credit sequence, Venat looks back on the Warrior of Light. Similarly, in the ending art, Venat is in the first group, the Ancients, but likewise looks back towards the second group, the main cast. This symbolizes her being relieved that she was able to pass on the torch to the Warrior of Light and the world can go on without her. She's also the only character who faces forward towards the audience, which further emphasizes the importance of her role in the story. And please keep this artwork in mind as I'm not yet finished. I'll bring it up again in my Hermes video, you can count on that. Alright, those have been my observations of Venat. Now, since this analysis has been a bit more mixed between critique, minor though it was, as well as the usual praising or neutral tones, I wanna end the video with this. Whether or not you agree with the character's choice, view her misrepresented as a hero or whatever, I hope we can all appreciate the hard work the developers put into her character, whether that be the dialogue, the voice direction and voice acting, the multiple high-quality songs dedicated to her character and so on, or the awesome fights, plural, we got with her, and the extra mile the developers went through to implement features such as trust in that fight. They put in all that effort because they wanted to provide us a story that is not just entertaining, but truly memorable in its themes and message. I'm saying this because it's sometimes all too easy to get carried away when criticizing something you are passionate about, but at the end of the day, it's a game we've all enjoyed, or at least I hope so. I don't know why else you would be watching such a long video on one of its characters, unless you really like my voice, in which case I'm humbled, really. Moreover, I plan to talk about the rest of the Ancients, so next up would be Hermes, and then Lahabrea and Elidibus after 6.4. But same as last time, it'll probably be a while as there's so much to talk about with these characters, hence creating the video can be a little exhausting. Nonetheless, if you're into these in-depth analyses, I recommend subbing the channel so you can be around for when I drop that video. Have a nice day!